Thank you so much for this very kind invitation. It's a great honor for me to be here with you. I turned 50 not that long ago. I know I don't look it, right? Okay? Asians don't raisin. That's black may not crack, but Asians don't raisin. So when I turned 50, I decided that it was very important of me to take my physical health and well-being very seriously. So I did what an academic researcher does. I researched what is the best way to get fit in American society today. So I used the academic researcher's most important tool, which is Google. So I went online and I Googled what is the best way to get fit today. And I discovered something called CrossFit. Any of y'all heard of this? CrossFit exercise program? Yeah, it's pretty popular. And I did some research and I went and figured out what was the philosophy behind CrossFit? What makes CrossFit work? And I found out that it's a philosophy of exercise called muscle confusion, which got me really excited because I've been practicing muscle confusion my entire life. And the way I did it was I wouldn't go to the gym for months and months at a time. And then when I went to the gym, my muscles were really confused and they got really angry at me. So I realized that confusion, disruption, things that cause some kind of dis-ease is actually not always a bad thing. We think confusion and disruption are bad things, but there are times when confusion and disruption are actually very good things. It might be true that that's why we get physically healthy, because we have moments of confusion and disruption, but could it also be true that our spiritual growth is also tied in to confusion and disruption? But as I was thinking through this, I realized that in the church in America in particular, our Western church, we don't like confusion and disruption in our spiritual lives. We want things to stay the same. And one of the ways that's evident is in the ways that we ignore parts of the scripture that talk about disruption and confusion. And there are times when we want to have conversations on things like justice and racism and poverty, and we don't want to have those conversations because it makes us uncomfortable, and we don't like disruption. But the Bible is actually filled with moments of disruption, confusion, and dis-ease. So several years ago, I wrote a book on the book of Lamentations. How many of you have read the book of Lamentations in the Old Testament? That's fantastic. Most people have not read of it or even heard of it and know that that's actually in the Bible. Lamentations is one of those obscure books of the Bible that sometimes we don't look at, partially because we're afraid of the disruption a book like Lamentations can cause. So I want to talk today about the book of Lamentations and the need for disruption when we start talking about things like racial justice, economic justice, the heart of God for justice. We might need a little bit of disruption. I want to give you a background on the book of Lamentations before we dive into it, tell you about what happens in the book of Lamentations and why it was written. Chapter 1, verse 1 says, "How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she who was once great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave." So what this passage is alluding to is that Lamentations was written for a particular purpose and reason. The nation of Israel had once been a great nation, as we see in verse 1. It was once full of people and a great among the nations, queen among the provinces. But this once great nation, especially under King David and King Solomon, began to rebel against God. The subsequent kings led the nation of Israel astray, and they began to worship idols and turn away from the worship of Yahweh. And because of that, God needed to bring punishment upon the nation of Israel and the people of God. And so the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed, and the southern kingdom was destroyed, and all that was left was the great capital city of Jerusalem. But eventually the Babylonians conquered the great city of Jerusalem. So this once great nation, filled with people, filled with a great capital, this capital of Jerusalem, was now deserted, like a widow, lost, had become a slave. This is probably, if you look at the history of Israel, the lowest moment in its history. The moment when their greatness was now devastated, and all they had left was this torn down city. The Babylonians, when they conquered the city of Jerusalem, they were ruthless conquerors. They tore down the walls and anything that would give security to the residents of Jerusalem. They burned the crops in the field and salted the fields so that nothing good can grow on them ever again. And the worst thing they did is they took the leaders of that community, the elders, the learned, the prophets, the priests, and the kings. And they got all those learned folks and they took them and sent them into exile into Babylon. So if this were to occur right now, what would happen is those in college, Those who are our political leaders, those who are our social leaders and our religious leaders, they will be sent away into exile. Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. Again, this is the lowest moment in Jerusalem and in Israel's history. Now, when something like this happens, when your nation is devastated and your people are lost and you see no future because all your leaders have been taken away, you have a couple of options here. The two options that I want to talk about, there are more than this, but the two major options you have is when things fall apart, you have one option of running away and hiding. Or the second option, trusting in the sovereignty of God. But let's look at this first option. When the devastation occurs, Jerusalem is destroyed, all the leaders are taken away, the people of Israel could actually say, why do we even keep trying? We've lost our home. We've lost our identity as God's chosen people. We've lost everything that means anything to us. Why do we keep up trying? We need to run away and hide. We need to quit and to give up. And it is in that context that the prophet Jeremiah writes a letter to the exile. This is what the Lord Almighty says to those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. He's saying to them, don't give up. Don't run away and hide. He says, build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have children. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Now, this is a very important passage. I've highlighted here the phrase, seek the peace. Pretty much every other time in the Old Testament and in the Bible, you see the phrase, seek the peace, and it attaches a city to it. It's the city of Jerusalem. Seek the peace of Jerusalem. 99.9% of the times when you see the phrase, seek the peace, it is to seek the peace of Jerusalem. This is one of the very few occasions where in the Bible it says not seek the peace of Jerusalem, but seek the peace of Babylon. Now, think with me. Of all the places in the world God would say to seek the peace of, Babylon would make no sense to them. Think about New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Las Vegas, all rolled into one. That's Babylon. It symbolized all that was wrong and evil in the world. And yet God says, not seek the peace of Jerusalem, which is the heavenly city of God, but seek the peace of Babylon, which is the most wicked city in the world at that time. Why would God say, seek the peace of Babylon? Because God says, even if you are in the worst place in the world, even if everything around you is falling apart, even when there is destruction and evil and sin all around you, Christians, believers in God, we never have the option of running away and hiding. We never have the option of hiding our head in the sand when things are falling apart around us. We cannot, as believers, as followers of Jesus, ever run away and hide from difficult situations. Here's part of the problem, however. In church history, we have seen over and over again that is the first thing the church oftentimes does, run away and hide. When difficult circumstances arise, the church has often responded by running away and hiding from difficult situations. I'll give you an example of this. When the United States was founded and the colonists came to the New World, they envisioned what is called the city set on a hill. The first governor of Massachusetts sees the land that will eventually become the great city of Boston. And he says, I envision a city set on a hill, a new Jerusalem, a new Zion, out of which the gospel will go forth. There was this optimism about the cities of our nation. But things began to change from the 17th to the 18th and into the 19th century. For several hundred years, the idea was our American cities will be cities set on a hill. But in the 20th century and the 19th century, the cities began to change quite a bit. There were two factors. The first factor was the movement of Eastern and Southern immigrants moving to the urban centers. Now, for most of American history, key immigrant communities were from Western and Northern Europe. They were British and Irish and German and Scandinavian. But in the 19th century, the immigration pattern changes. And you start getting not Northern and Western European, but Southern and Eastern European. And there was something different about the Southern and Eastern Europeans. They were not Protestant. They were not German Lutherans. They were not Scandinavian Lutherans. They were not Scottish Presbyterians. They were Italian Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Slavic Jews. And these folks started moving into these urban centers. And so the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, seeing Catholics and Jews and Orthodox Christians moving into their neighborhood, began to get a little bit afraid. In fact, they started writing things about the cities that were extraordinarily negative. They said that our cities have become caves of rum and Romanism. That the cities was the destroyer of common good, of family life, and of individual characters. So many of these urban centers now were no longer Jerusalem, city set on a hill, but they were now Babylons, places of evil. So instead of staying and engaging the city, many of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants started to run away from the city. There was a second factor here, and that second factor was not immigration, but what we now call in history the Great Migration. Post-Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, most African Americans are in the Deep South, particularly in the Mississippi Delta. But obviously, after the Civil War and after emancipation, there is freedom that comes to the African slaves, and they're looking for a place. The future is not in the South. They're going to go back to the plantation and work. That's not the future. So they began to envision a different future in a different part of the country. And they see that in the northern cities of the United States. So the great migration of African Americans who are now free, they start moving into urban centers, many here in the Midwest and on the East Coast. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia gets a huge influx of African Americans post-Civil War all the way through into the latter part of the 20th century. So neighborhoods in urban centers begin to change. White neighborhoods become black neighborhoods. White communities and white churches become black communities and black churches. And the same response that the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants had against Eastern and Southern Europeans was the same response, maybe even stronger, against African Americans moving into urban centers. And that response was white flight. To run away from the problem, to turn around and say, we want to have nothing to do with the cities anymore because they're filled with people we don't like. We're going to run away and hide. One of the ways that this is most evident is in the way church buildings were planted and started at the height of white flight. The height of white flight was post-World War II into the 1960s. And what you begin to see is as whites begin to leave urban centers and move to suburban communities and even exurb communities, they began to build new church buildings. So you see this in this number here. They abandoned the old church buildings in the cities, and they built new church buildings in the suburbs. In 1945, $26 million was spent on new church buildings. 15 years later, at the height of white flight, you get $1 billion spent on new church buildings. I mean, think about this. $26 million, that's the cost of one building these days. But in 1960, you're getting $1 billion new church buildings, money spent on new church buildings, because people were leaving the city and moving to the suburbs. I went and thought through what kind of buildings were being built in the suburbs. And one of the things I noticed was that a lot of church buildings built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even into the 1970s have an architecture that look like this. It's got the slanted roof. It's got a little bit of an arch on the side. How many of you have seen church buildings or sanctuaries that look like this? Very, very common form of architecture. Now, I was at a building dedication in the 1970s. And they were dedicating a building that looked like this. It was the middle of January, just like this. It was a cold weather state. So if you know anything about how heat works, the heating vents are on the floor. Where does heat go on a cold day? Right up into the roof. And so all the hot air goes right into the rafters. And you literally have the frozen chosen on the ground and all that warm air up in the rafters. Now, I'm an 8-year-old kid at a church dedication. I am freezing to death, looking up at all this empty space saying, whose stupid idea was it to build a church building to look like this? Why did we build a church building to look like this? The senior pastor gets up and said, it was my idea to build the church building to look like this. And he said, I want you to picture this entire building turned upside down. When you turn this building upside down, what are you looking at? And he said, you're looking at the bottom of a boat. You're looking at the bottom, a hull of a ship. Now, where in the Bible do you read about a really big ship? Yes, Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark. Now, what is the church saying when we build our churches to look like Noah's Ark? We're saying we don't care about the world out there. Let the judgment come and wipe you all out. We don't care, as long as we are safe in Noah's Ark. In fact, we're going to go one step further. You all have that evil secular literature out there. We'll have our Christian literature. You all have that evil secular art out there. We'll have our Christian art. You all have your secular music. We'll have not so good Christian music. You all have your secular coloring books. We'll have Christian coloring books. We'll just create a little microcosm of the world out there, just sanitize Christian version of it right here in Noah's Ark. And who cares what happens to the world out there as long as we are safe in Noah's Ark? This is the exact opposite of what Jeremiah 29 challenges us to do. The church ran away and hid. Ran away and hid out in Noah's Ark for several decades. Now, you're saying, wait, that's 100 years ago, 50 years ago. That's a long time ago. We don't do that anymore, or do we? In the last 70 plus years, American society has again experienced a dramatic shift, very similar to what happened post-Civil War. In the last 50 plus years, post-World War II, our society has completely changed. One of the key reasons was a change in the immigration laws in 1965. Now, one thing I need to point out, the change in immigration laws was not an opening of the doors to let anybody and everybody in. That didn't happen. People look at 1965 and say, well, there are 10 immigrants in 1964, then we got 6 million immigrants in 1966. That's not what happened. That's fake news. There's never been a moment in American history where America said, let's open the doors wide and let anybody and everybody in. Actually, no, it happened one time. That's when the Pilgrims came and the Native Americans said, yeah, let's do that. Let's let anybody and everybody in. And what could go wrong? So in American history, we've never said, let's let anybody and everybody in. What happened in 1965 as part of the civil rights movement was to do away with racist laws. There were racist laws in the books that said we don't want certain people from certain parts of the world. The first of these was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Can anybody guess what that might have done? Yes, it excluded Chinese people. We want to exclude Chinese people. What do you want to call it? How about the Chinese Exclusion Act? They were not playing around here. They said, we don't want people from this country or from this part of the world because we don't like the shape of their eyes, the color of their skin, we don't like what they do, we don't like how they worship. We don't want them, so we're going to ban them from coming with an act that says we don't want them. I'm so glad we don't do that anymore. So what you saw with the Chinese Exclusion Act was a series of laws that were explicitly racist. We don't want certain people of a certain skin color. We don't want certain people of a certain shade of color. We don't want them, so we're going to have laws that ban them from coming into the United States. 1965, the change was not let's let anybody and everybody in. The change was let's do away with racism. And let's say we will take people, not based upon their whiteness of their skin, but all people will be allowed in. So what we see is not going from 10 immigrants to 6 million immigrants, but the distribution of the pie is changing. Not the size of the pie. The size of the pie grows incrementally over a 50, 60-year time period. But it's not, let's let anybody and everybody in. It's the ones we let in, let's not be racist about it. And let's change the distribution of the pie post-1965, which meant more immigrants from Latin America and from Asia. And because of that slow, gradual influx of non-white immigrants from 1965, after several decades, the demographics of American society begins to change. And we see this because we are seeing in 2008, a third of the U.S. population are now of non-European descent, ethnic minorities. The key number here, though, is 2011. In 2011, the birth rate changed, which is a monumental moment. Half the births in America are now of those of non-European descent. An obvious statistic that follows. 5 years after the birth rate changes, 5 years after, what else changed? The kindergarten class changes, of course. 5 years ago, you had a birth rate of 50% non-white. 5 years later, you have a kindergarten class of mostly non-white. That number getting faster and faster so that by 2023, half of all the children in America, everyone under the age of 18, will be those of non-European descent. This is a monumental change, but I want you to take a look at this. This is not tied to immigration. The browning of America is not tied to immigration. The changing demographics of American society is not tied to immigration. It is tied to birth rates. The 2011 number is not going to change. It's only going to get higher and higher. So here's my mantra. The wall is not enough. You want to build a wall? That's not enough. I want to build a dome. Say it with me. Build that dome. Build that dome. We're going to get Canada to pay for a dome. We're going to seal off the United States of America from anybody else from coming in and going out. Build that dome. You can build that dome, maybe for $5.7 billion. You can build that dome. This will not change. America is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial society. Deal with it. This is our reality. So we cannot run away and hide from this reality. We cannot retreat into our little Noah's Arks. We cannot retreat into our little church circles of ethnic similarity, homogeneity. We cannot do this because this is not the world that God has called us into. The world has changed. In fact, what's happening is very exciting because as immigrants come, as our nation becomes more diverse, we are becoming a Christian people. Because the white population is declining in Christian faith, but the immigrant population is very much a Christian community. The new immigrants represent not the de-Christianization of American society, but the de-Europeanization of American Christianity. So here's what I want you to think about. 1965, the world was different. 2040, the world will be radically different. In an 80-year time span, the world will have radically changed. You will be having to deal, especially as young leaders of the future, with the diversity that is already here and that is not going away. My question is, are you getting a 1965 education or are you getting a 2040 education? Are you being prepared to be a servant and a leader for 2040 or are you being prepared to be a servant and a leader for 1965? So that the books you read, the teachers you have, the curriculum that you follow, is it preparing you for 1965 or is it preparing you for 2050? If you don't have a diversity of faculty and staff and leaders and pastors who are teaching you, then you are getting a 1965 education. And so you should go to the bursar's office. I would like to pay 1965 tuition because I'm getting a 1965 education. Or do you say, I want a 2040, 2050 education because God has brought me into this world at such a moment as this so that I can be a servant for the world that is changing very rapidly and drastically? I want to point out one thing from the book of Lamentations itself about how we take on the changes that are occurring. There's a lot of questions about the authorship of the book of book of Lamentations. Traditionally, historically, Jeremiah has been credited with being the author of the book of Lamentations. The answers are pretty logical and straightforward. What happened is that, like I said, the exile occurs, and all the learned and all the leaders are sent away into exile, which means that those who could read or write, and Lamentations required a significant amount of literacy to write that, meant that those who could read or write were probably almost all of them were sent away. But we do know of at least one exception to that exile. And that was the prophet Jeremiah. If you read through the book of Jeremiah, what you'll find in Jeremiah is that Jeremiah is the one that says, give in to the Babylonians. That's the rightful judgment of God. The Babylonians knew about this. They said, Jeremiah might be on our side. We're not going to take him to exile. We'll leave him in Jerusalem. So possibly the only candidate who could write a book like Lamentations might actually be the prophet Jeremiah. But here's the problem. The style and writing of the book of Jeremiah in the original Hebrew, when you compare that to the style and writing of the book of Lamentations, it is like two different people wrote the book. It is such a stark difference. Maybe the comparison I would draw is you have Shakespeare and you have Kendrick Lamar, all right? You all know who Kendrick Lamar is. Both are great writers, by the way. Both are fantastic writers. They just have slightly different styles of writing. Would you say? Would you agree with that? Now, only one of them has a Pulitzer, but I'm not going to say who. So you got Shakespeare and you got Kendrick. They're both great writers, but they're probably not the same person because their style of writing is so different. That's kind of what it is with Jeremiah and Lamentations. You have two great literary works, but they're clearly, absolutely impossible that the same person wrote these two books. So the question then is, if not Jeremiah, then who? If Jeremiah is the only candidate who could write the book, why does the style sound so different? So here's my analysis of this. When I looked through that, I said, all right, Jeremiah is probably the only one left in Jerusalem who had the literary capacity to write this down. But if you read through the book of Jeremiah, you'll note something very interesting. And that is that the voice of a narrator is mostly absent throughout the book. And what you get instead are the voices of the widows and the orphans, the women, the children, the sick, the lame, the blind, the oppressed. Their voices rise up. Jeremiah is the prophet. He is the leader. He is the respected elder in the community. But what he does is he shuts up and gets out of the way. Is he puts down his privilege and says, I want to raise up the voices of women, children, the sick, the lame, the crippled, the blind, the oppressed. Their voices are going to rise up. I claim that Lamentations might be the most feminine book of the Bible, because what it does is it elevates the voice of women, because Jeremiah, the male prophet, gets out of the way so that women's voices can be raised up. What happens in the book of Lamentations is that Jeremiah calls for all the voices to be heard. The voices of the women, the voices of the oppressed, the voices of the sick, the blind, the lame, the crippled. Those are the voices that Jeremiah moves out of the way so that they can be heard. I'll close with a story. I speak at a lot of conferences. It's part of my work as a professor, part of my work in ministry. And after a while, I just get sick of conference after conference. For one thing, they keep telling the same thing over and over again. So I would go to a church planting conference, and they would say, be nice to newcomers. Really? That's why I paid $1,000 for this conference? Or you go to a leadership conference and says, be a servant. Really? I could have read that in a book at home. So I get kind of sick of these conferences. But one of the things that happened is that people will come up to me as a workshop leader, as a plenary speaker, and ask me the secret to ministry. How do you succeed in ministry? I was a pastor for 17 years. I'm a professor now. So they'll keep asking me, how do you succeed in ministry? And I'll give them a very simple answer. Stop coming to these conferences. You spend $500 on the registration, $500 on the airfare, $500 on meals, $500 for the hotel. You spend $2,000 to learn nothing new. So stop coming to these conferences to hear these talking heads. What you really need is a praying mom. Is a praying mom or a praying grandmother. That's the secret to what God is going to do in your life and through your life. My mom is 86 years old. She has dementia and Alzheimer's. She's also very physically frail. But my life would be very different without her prayers. She was a single mom. I grew up, it's hard to tell now, but I grew up in an inner city neighborhood in Baltimore. I say a rough neighborhood in Baltimore, but that's redundant. I grew up in an inner city neighborhood in Baltimore. My mom, as a single mom, worked 2 jobs. A day shift at a carryout, an inner city carryout, where they had the plexiglass front and the lazy Susan passing the money and the food back and forth. And then she would go and work the night shift at an inner city nursing home, changing the bedpans and taking care of the senior citizen residents. So she worked 20 hours a day, 6 days a week. And then she would rush home after her night shift to fix breakfast for her kids, send them off, and then she would sleep 2 hours and then go back and work the day shift. She did this to keep her family together. We lived in a rough neighborhood because we couldn't afford to live anywhere else. She did that for years and years and years so that she could give an opportunity for her 4 kids. The fact is that she has actually succeeded in that sense. All 4 of her kids are in Christian ministry and education of some kind. We followed her lead, not because she was a Christian pastor, but because she set the example. About 20, 30 years ago, she showed me the condition of her knees. Most of us have 1 kneecap on each knee. And when we kneel, our kneecaps hit the floor. My mom has 5 kneecaps on each knee because she has been praying on a hardwood floor an hour or 2 every day for her kids and for her grandchildren for 30, 40, 50 years. And when you pray on the floor like that for 30, 40, 50 years, your knees can't take that kind of pressure. So her knees have cracked open. And her knees now conform to the shape of the floor when she kneels before God. That's the kind of prayers we need. Those are the kind of saints we need to hear about. Not some hotshot 29-year-old pastor with a fancy glasses and skinny jeans. I don't need to hear another story like that ever again in my life. But let's hear the stories of the women, the grandmothers, the mothers, the crippled, the lame, the sick, the blind, the oppressed, who have a powerful story to tell, a story of being on their knees before God. So if you want to talk about justice in the world, get on your knees before God. You want to talk about racial justice in the world, Get your moms and your grandmothers to get on their knees before God, and you yourself get on your knees before God. Justice does not happen overnight. It happens from decades of prayer on our knees. And let's lift up those voices that have been previously silenced, those voices that we have kept in the dark, because that's what's going to prepare you for the next 40 years. God, thank you for the work you're doing at Andrews. I pray, Lord, that you will continue to bring the wisdom and the truth into this community, that they might be changed by your words and your truth. I pray this in your name. Let the church say, amen.